All hell was breaking out in Mississippi. The just all hell was breaking out. That was why the Post sent me down to look to see what the mood was among the black community.
Journalist Dorothy Gilliam next on Evening Exchange. Hi, I'm Kojo Nnamdi. I first saw Dorothy Gilliam standing in a funeral home in Harlem on a rainy day in 1976 when the Harlem skies wept in mourning over the death of Paul Robeson, the singer, actor, and activist. Little did I know at the time about Dorothy Gilliam's stellar past or her even more stellar future. A former reporter and columnist for the Washington Post, Dorothy Gilliam has won awards too numerous to mention and served as president of the National Association of Black Journalists. Her work during the civil rights movement is captured in the documentary Freedom's Call. Dorothy Gilliam, welcome.
Thank you so much, Kojo. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd forgotten that it had been that occasion when we'd first met.
I walked into that funeral home because I was working in WHUR radio at the time, managed to persuade the management to send me to that funeral. It was raining, walked into that funeral home, and there was this gorgeous woman scribbling in a notebook. And I introduced myself, and it turned out to be you. You later wrote a book called Paul Robeson, All America.
Yes.
Can you reflect a little bit about that? Talk about the influence that Paul Robeson had on you and on the world?
Well, Paul Robeson was a truly a Renaissance man. And I'm of that generation that was kind of kept away from Paul Robeson growing up. You know, growing up in the 50s and in high school at that time, we didn't hear much about him. And so at that point in 1972, I was working as an assistant editor in the style section of the Post. And when I heard about this salute to Paul Robeson, I wanted to go cover it. I wasn't doing a lot of writing. I was mostly working as an editor, but occasionally I would go and cover stories. And that, when I went to cover the salute to him at Carnegie Hall, I was absolutely stunned at the audience. It was such an integrated audience. There were people there from all walks of life. And I began to learn about this figure who I felt had been hidden from me. And I
Be sure to give this video a like. And what's your favorite Paul Robeson movie?
figured if he had been, his life had been hidden from me, it had been hidden from so many others. And so when I had, when I came back, I wrote the story about the salute. And as you know, as a journalist, we are often asked to write the obituary of famous people who are aging. And so I had a chance to write his obituary. And the more I knew about him, the more the more fascinated I became. And of course, what they do with those obituaries is they put them in type, as they did in those days. Now it's an entirely different process. But until the person actually passes away. So Robeson, that was 1972. Robeson didn't die until 1976.
Correct.
But from that obituary, I decided that I really wanted to write a book. And I was able to get a contract and wrote the book. And Robeson is, amazes me continually.
That book helped to introduce Robeson to a lot of young people in America who'd never heard of him.
I think so, and I'm very pleased to hear that. And but his life, you know, here was truly a person who was an athlete, a scholar, a linguist, an actor, a singer, and a true humanitarian. Because here was a person who was willing to give up, you know, worldwide acclaim in order to stand for those things in which he believed. And Harry Belafonte is sounding a little like him these days, I have to tell you.
And of course, Robeson had a great influence on Harry Belafonte. I was growing up as an adolescent in Guyana when my father would tell me about Paul Robeson and said, but they don't like to talk about him because they say he is a communist. And of course, the fact that nobody was talking about him fascinated me. So I was fascinated with Robeson and began to learn more about him. But what I've been learning more about recently as a result of the documentary Freedom to Call is Dorothy Gilliam. I did not realize that you started your journalism career when you were a teenager. How did that happen?
Well, I had finished high school at 16, and I got a job at the Louisville Defender. My dad was an AME minister, and so we had, even though I was born in Memphis, Tennessee, I actually grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, because that's where he was sent by the AME church, and that's where his church was. So I got a job right after graduation from high school. I got a job at the Louisville Defender, and I was hired as a secretary to Mr. Frank Stanley. And one day Mr. Stanley came in and he said, and I worked in, I was also attending college. I was a freshman at Ursuline College. And so after my classes, I'd come and type Mr. Stanley's letters or do whatever. And I knew that I had an interest in journalism, but this was my way of trying to test that interest. So one day Mr. Stanley came in and he said, Dorothy, the society editor is ill. And I thought, I'm sorry to hear that. I wondered why he was telling me. And he said, we're going to send you out to cover some party stories. And so at the ripe old age of 17, I found myself writing society stories for the Louisville Defender.
You know, I hear so many of these stories. You know Francis Ward very well, my friend.
Yes.
Francis Ward later became a columnist, of course, for the Miami Herald and worked here for a while. But once I had a conversation with him, and Francis said, you know, after I graduated college, when I started working at a newspaper, I started as a custodian. And he eventually became a reporter for the newspaper.
Well, what happened was that I realized, working at the Louisville Defender, that I really wanted to become a better journalist. So I transferred to Lincoln University in Jefferson City, Missouri, and went to the School of Journalism there. And so I graduated in 1957 from Lincoln University.
And 1957 was the year of the Little Rock Nine. Those 9 young people trying to go to high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. How did you get involved with that story?
Well, my first job out of Lincoln was at the Tri-State Defender in Memphis. I had tried to get a job on the daily newspaper in my hometown, the Louisville Courier-Journal and Times, and they basically, they were not interested at all. They just, I mean, at that point, race was indeed a factor. They basically said, you know, we don't have any internships, you know, we don't have anything. So the first job I was able to get was the Tri-State Defender. And I went down to Memphis in August of 1957, and Little Rock broke in September of 1957. And of course, I was definitely a rookie. And my boss was a guy named Alex Wilson. And Alex Wilson was a pretty big timer by then within the Defender chain. And he, of course, went over to cover the story. But as it turned out, Mr. Wilson was horribly beaten. And he had left me behind. He said, you're too young, you're a girl, stay behind. And so I'm back in Memphis doing what he told me to do. When, you know, the television station started showing me images of Mr. Wilson being beaten. And so I got myself together and went off to Little Rock. And there was, you know, one of the stories, one of the most important stories of the civil rights movement. And I was able to cover that. Mr. Wilson didn't have much of a choice about letting me help cover it, since he was truly incapacitated, although he kept going. But I'm really happy to be able to tell his story in this documentary.
A story of Alex Wilson, among others, is told in this documentary.
Yes.
So that means that you know Ernie Green when he was just a high school student. Ernest Green, of course, later became an assistant secretary of labor.
Well, actually, I didn't actually know Ernie, because I don't remember meeting him at that point. I was in Ms. Daisy Bates's home.
You were just a few years older than he was at the time.
Right, I think I was maybe 2 years older. But I was in Daisy Bates's home, and we were, you know, there with the journalists, and we were in the middle of of all of that, that drama, because, Daisy Bates's home, we didn't have any place to stay. I think there was one motel for black people in that city, and that was a problem with journalists, black journalists covering the civil rights movement. There were not hotels there. We had to sleep wherever we could sleep. When I was covering later in in Oxford, Mississippi, I had to stay in a black funeral home. We just, there was, people forget, and one of the reasons I thought it was so important to do this documentary, people forget that the stories have to be told, and black journalists are going to go and cover those stories. But that in terms of, from the perspective of the whites who live there, and in their fury that these stories were being taken out of the South and broadcast and printed and telegraphed to the larger world, journalists were their lives were just as cheap as any other black person there.
And Dorothy, courage is a sometime thing. It's very difficult for people to understand. We could understand exactly what Mr. Wilson was saying to you, girl, don't come here. What a lot of people don't understand is why you went. You're a teenage girl practically, you're still very young, and you're going into a cauldron of racial hatred. Didn't you feel fear at the time?
I did feel fear, and but I think part of the whole idea of being a journalist, even at that point, is that you go where the story is. And one of the things that attracted me to going there was that here was, even at that point, I'm not sure it penetrated deeply, but here was one of the big stories actually of the civil rights movement. And there was no doubt that I felt fear, but I tell you what happened and what helped me. Ernest Withers, who is the photographer who is also in this documentary.
Yes, indeed. Legendary photographer.
Legendary photographer. He was in Little Rock with Mr. Withers. I'm sorry, with Mr. Wilson, rather. He had come back to Memphis to have his film developed. And so when I was deciding to go, I called Mr. Withers because I heard he was back. And so I went back to Little Rock with him. And I knew that he was going to help negotiate the South and help get me in and get me out. He knew where to go. And he was really an important part of my ability. Even when, by the time I covered the University of Mississippi, the integration of Ole Miss by James Meredith, I was by then a reporter at the Washington Post.
James Meredith is in the documentary, as is Ernest Withers.
Right. And but when the Post asked me to go to Oxford to cover the story, the first person I called was Ernest Withers, and I flew down to Memphis and met up with him, and then together we went into the South. But once again, it was part of what at least helped to somewhat ameliorate my fear was the knowledge that if I traveled with Ernest Withers, he would be able to, he said, yeah, you knew what I was going to yes sir and no sir if I have to, right? And I said, you know what, Ernest? Yes, I knew that. But but truly he was a brave man and a wonderful companion.
You started at the Washington Post in 1961, and you stayed there except for a brief period to raise your children until 2003, if I'm not correct.
Right.
Nevertheless, especially when one sees the documentary, you understand that those early experiences with Alex Wilson and Ernest Withers and James Meredith and the like still seem to be the strongest memories of your journalistic career. How come?
Well, in many ways, they help to set the path and the course for my journalistic career. I certainly didn't know it when it was occurring, but as I look back at it, I can see that what I gained from those early years and watching the courage of an Alex Wilson, a courage that you talked about. Courage is a sometimes thing, but where does one summon the courage to say, when you're unexpectedly attacked by a mob, to say, I decided that I wasn't going to run. I decided that no matter what happened, I was going to walk, even if they killed me. You know, that's not a courage that you mull over, you know, and decide you're going to have at an opportune moment. That is a deep sense of awareness of who you are and what you're doing and the importance of what you're doing. And so it was exposure to people like that that really helped to uh, uh, make me understand what journalism was about. And you know, I think I tried to do some decent work after that, but it all in many ways went back to these
You
early
did
years.
a lot of decent work after that, inside and outside of the newsroom. You come into this town where everybody in Washington who comes here, it seems, seeking power. You are at the Washington Post in 1961 at a time when there were very few African American journalists at the Washington Post. Is it the background that you had in the civil rights movement that caused you to be not intimidated by this town?
I don't know. I guess I hadn't really added it up in quite that way, but certainly it helped, because one of the things that I did early on, after I was in Little Rock and worked for the Tri-State Defender, I had an opportunity to work for Jet magazine, and I worked for Jet for almost 2 years before going to what I say get some white credentials at Columbia and then being hired by the Post. But
you did the master's program at Columbia.
At master's, right. But the time at Jet was another important time in helping to really set my sights on, I think, both the importance of our people and also the strength of black people. And it really reinforced the desire to write about them, you know, to get beyond the stereotypes, to get beyond the, you know, to get into the real life of real people. And so I think, you know, all of those experiences joined together to, you know, help me set my
ground you,
course.
so to speak. It was the grounding that carried you through.
And I needed it, because it was very difficult at the Post in those early days. As you said, there were 2 other black reporters there, 2 men. I was the first woman, or at least that's what I'm told. It's always shaky when you say you were the first anything. But you know, there were so many issues just trying to get a taxi cab to get there, to get your story. And of course, it was a time when I couldn't come back and use that as I couldn't explain what was happening to anybody, because I knew there were people there who wanted me to fail, who expected me to fail, and so that would have been seen as an excuse to mask incompetence if I continued to say, you know, I'm late, you know, I'm 5 minutes past deadline because a taxi wouldn't pick me up.
Right.
And so you just had to learn to suck it up and you know, bear those kind of things and you know, attempt
Indeed,
to.
there are those of us who remember the Metro 8 minority reporters, black reporters of the Washington Post in the Metro section who actually sued the Washington Post for discrimination. The Washington Post is, of course, a much different place these days, and you are one of the reasons it is a different place, because you work to bring minorities to the Post, as I said, inside and outside of the newsroom, even as you had to be covering, reporting, and then raising children on a regular basis, and then coming back to the paper again. At what point and why did you decide to become a columnist?
I decided to become a columnist kind of in an offhand way. I had been at the end of my years working as an assistant editor. I really felt it was time for a change. And even though I was shaking in my boots, I remember going to sending Ben Bradley a note saying, you know, I really would like to be the editor of the Washington Post magazine. And somehow that memo got lost. And I finally, you know, went up to the front and said, you know, I really sent you a memo and you never answered, but I wanted to be, you know, the editor of the Washington Post magazine. And basically, you know, he said, well, you know, we're not ready to change that yet, but is there anything else you'd like to do? And I said, well, I think I'd like to write a column. And I got the opportunity.
And a terrific column it was too. And then you became president of the National Association of Black of Black journalists at what I would consider a watershed moment in that organization's history, the moment at which it was set to become a really national influence. Tell us about that experience. Why did you do it?
Well, in 1991, I took a year off from the Post and went to the Gannett Center for Media Studies to write what I thought was going to be a book on racial diversity in the media, the importance of it, why it was needed, etc. And so I was at the Gannett Center in New York, and I was just struck repeatedly by how little attention all the people who would, the media leaders who would come in, how little attention they really were paying to diversity. I'm sure there were exceptions, but you know, it just struck me, and I remember getting angry, and I'm thinking, you know, these people don't care about diversity, and you know, I'm painting with a pretty broad brush. There certainly were exceptions, but it occurred to me during that year that, you know, rather than try to write about the problem, I need to become more active, and I made a decision that year to, you know, run for an office in the National Association of Black Journalists. I had actually gotten my feet wet in terms of this whole issue of journalists working for the larger issue of getting more minorities in media back in the 70s, when Bob Maynard got me involved in the Institute for Journalism Education.
Bob Maynard, the former editor of the Washington Post and later the publisher of the San Jose...
of the Oakland Tribune.
Of the Oakland Tribune,
yes,
I'm sorry, go right ahead.
Yes, and Bob had been really involved at that point in starting an organization called the Institute for Journalism Education to train more minorities for media. And so he got me involved in that very early, working, you know, coming down, helping to train. Then I was named to the board, and so I worked on that board for many years, and actually also served as chair of that board. So I had been kind of in the business. This is in addition to, as you say, working as a journalist and trying to raise 3 daughters and all the other things. I had become very involved in trying to get more diversity in media. So it was in a way a natural next step to want to be involved in something like the National Association of Black Journalists, which was primarily an activist organization. And so first I ran for vice president, and then 2 years later was elected president. And I think you're so correct in terms of characterizing it as a moment, as a watershed moment, because it was also a time when there was a discussion about having the first unity convention of all the journalists associations of color. And so that was, while I was president, we had the first unity convention where the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, Asian journalists, Native American journalists, and Black journalists came together and did a joint convention. In Atlanta, yes.
1994 or 96 was it?
1994.
1994, I remember.
Yeah.
I was entertained in the suite of the president of the National Association of Black Journalists on that particular occasion. But you went on, and you are now well, you did serve as a fellow at the George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs for the 2003 and 2004 academic year, but what I really want to talk to you about is that you are currently director of the Prime Movers Project at George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs. What's that all about?
Well, in my final years at the Post, I was able to start a program at the Post called the Young Journalist Development Program.
I remember.
And that was a program where we sent Washington Post reporters out to schools in the Washington area with the idea of helping to strengthen and revitalize newspapers. And one of the things that struck me was the year we started that, you know, not a single high school in Washington had a newspaper. And, you know, I didn't know about this, and I thought, you know, where will the next generation of minority journalists come from if we don't start at the high school level? And so in 2003, when I retired from the Post, I went to GW with the thought of trying to start a new program. And we were able to raise money from the Knight Foundation, and now we're ending the 2nd year of the Prime Movers program. And again, we're working with 4 media companies, USA Today, National Public Radio, WJLA TV, USA Today Live, and we're sending reporters and journalists into high schools in the city and in Northern Virginia primarily. So we're hoping to grow this program and maybe take it national, because I think the model of a university acting as the matchmaker between news media companies and high school students work. I think news media companies are willing to release their journalists to go into high schools to help strengthen student media, and of course also find diverse talent. But they just aren't willing to have to undergo all the administrative and negotiating with the school systems and teachers and all that. But if you have an entity that does it, then I think news media companies are showing that they're willing to go in and be a part of shaping the next generation.
One of the things your life shows, Dorothy Gilliam, for those who come to Washington, hard-driving, ambitious journalists, that you took time off from the Washington Post to raise your 3 daughters and you were able to resume your career as a reporter and to have a successful career as a reporter. I think there's an important lesson there for young people.
Well, I certainly, when I left the Post, I had no idea that I would necessarily ever be able to go back. But I did, reapply for a job that I heard was available, and I was able to get it. But I did take off for about 7 years, and I think they were important years in the life. Oh no, not at all. In the life of raising 3 daughters.
On behalf of every African American journalist who has worked in this town and others, and on behalf of journalists in general, Dorothy Gilliam, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Kojo. It's an honor being interviewed by you.
That's our program for this evening. I am Kojo Nnamdi. Stay well. Good night.
Who would you like for me to do a video on next? What are your thoughts about this video? Please share them in the comments. Please be honest when answering these questions. Share this video with anyone you deem necessary. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.